One of the great things about virtualization is the amount of flexibility we have. We can move these machines a lot easier than we could physical machines, even across data centers, even across companies. So it gives us a tremendous amount of flexibility. So there are a couple different ways that you can move virtual machines. We're going to talk about doing live migrations, quick migration, storage migration, and importing and exporting VMs. Now, as far as a live migration goes, one of the prerequisites is that you have to have 2 or more servers running Hyper-V role or Hyper-V server that are in the same Active Directory domain or trusting domain, so in the same forest. The same processor manufacturer on both Hyper-V servers, and the VM to be migrated must be using virtual hard disks, which most of them would probably be using virtual hard disks. So a live migration is enabled by default in clustered Hyper-V servers, but not in non-clustered servers. So if it's a non-clustered server, this is not going to be enabled by default. So to enable or disable live migrations, you'll have to do this in the settings window if you're on a non-clustered version. You can still do a live migration even if it's not clustered though. So it's important to mention that. All right, so this is the where you'll see the settings to do a live migration. So there's different types of live migrations. There's 4 types. There's a cluster live migration, which you can do when you're running a cluster. You could do a live migration if you have SMB shares, which are basically Windows file shares. Share-nothing live migrations, where there's nothing in common between the 2 Hyper-V servers, or a cross-version live migration when you're converting between 2 different versions. So cluster live migrations, in order to do this, you have to have 2 or more Hyper-V servers that are configured with failover clustering. So you have to have 2 of these servers. They all have to be in the failover, configured for failover clustering in order to do cluster live migrations, and they have to be using shared storage that you set up with CSVs, which we talked about previously. So to perform the cluster live migration, you're going to select the VM in the failover cluster manager. You're going to click Move in the Actions pane, and then point to a live migration, and then click Best Possible Node, or you can just select a node. So that's probably the easiest way to do it, and probably the fastest way to move it. And basically that's to move your VM to another cluster, if you want to manually move it to another cluster node. The other option is a live migration with SMB shares, which is basically Windows file shares. So you can perform a live migration between 2 Hyper-V servers that aren't clustered if the VMs are stored on a file share. So this is the next best option. If you're not using clustered Hyper-V, then you can use file shares. But again, this makes the assumption that the virtual machines are stored on a file share, which is not always the case. So you would have to move it to a file share first. Which might be kind of difficult. So permissions on the share must grant access to both the Hyper-V server computer accounts, and you must log on to the source Hyper-V server to perform the migration or configure constrained delegation. So you do have to have access to the source server in order to do this type of migration. A Sharednothing migration is done between 2 Hyper-V servers that have no common storage. So the VM's files are stored in local storage on the Hyper-V server. So if you're not using shared disk, right? If both Hyper-V servers would not have access to the same shared volume, then you'll have to actually physically move the machine from one to the other. I know that doesn't sound like it would be a live migration, but Hyper-V does support that. What happens is the Hyper-V storage is copied from the source Hyper-V server while it's running. So while the virtual machine is running, it's going to move all of the files over to the new machine, and it's just going to use basically SMB to do that, but it's going to move it from one location to another. When we do an SMB shared load storage migration, which I talked about previously, the files are not actually moved. It's just the control is released from one virtual machine server and delegated to a new virtual machine. So you have 2 Hyper-V servers running that are not clustered, and you're transferring control from one to the other, but it doesn't have to move the files because they're shared and accessible to both. But in this case, we're actually moving the entire VM from one host to another host. So that whole guest is moving from one host to another host to its local storage. It's using SMB to do that, right? So it's a Windows file share still. But the way it works is the machine continues to run on the source server. It moves everything over to the destination, and when that's done, it's going to basically take a snapshot of memory, and then so the last thing it's going to do is take memory and anything that's ephemeral while the machine is running at that point in time, move it to the new server, and then control is passed to the new server, and that's it. And then your migration is done. Now your machine's running on the new server. So that's the other way you could do it. You can use the Sharednothing live migrations. Now, a cross-version live migration is any of these options I've described, with the exception of the cluster migration, where you're going from 2012 server to Windows Server 2012 R2. So you basically, this is if you're upgrading your Windows Server to 2012 R2, but it's important to note that you can't go backwards. So you can't take a 2012. Once you migrate a VM from 2012 to 2012 R2, you won't be able to migrate it back down to 2012 using this method. So again, it's really just geared towards doing a migration when you're doing an upgrade. So those are all the live migration options. Then we have the quick migration option. So quick migration is available only between Hyper-V servers in a failover cluster. So everything has to be in a failover cluster, and it results in about a minute or two of downtime, or more of downtime, I should say. So it involves copying the VM data to the destination Hyper-V node, saving the VM state in the source node, and then copying the virtual machines to the Hyper-V node. So that's a quick migration. A storage migration is used when we're only going to move the storage from one volume to another. So that virtual disk is getting moved from one volume. So let's say we have the virtual disk stored on an iSCSI SAN somewhere, and we've decided to upgrade to a newer SAN, maybe a faster SAN or something like that, or maybe we have our virtual machine on the wrong tier. Maybe it needs to be on a faster tier server because they're using more resources than they can. So we can move just the storage files. So we can move just the virtual disk to a new storage volume. And this can be done while it's running, or you can do it when it shuts down. So you can do it either way. And this is the dialog box for when you're doing a storage migration. And finally, we can do import and export, which is, this is kind of the, there's two purposes that you would do an export, really, in my book. And that's if you are moving to a new platform. For example, if you're going to move to VMware, or you're going from VMware to Hyper-V or something like that. It could also be because you're doing a backup, and you want to be able to have an archive copy of the VM that you can go back to later on. You may also do this for if you're moving a VM to another organization. So again, according to our textbook, you would do this because you're exporting to create a backup, like I just said, or exporting a VM to create a copy, which you can import into a new VM somewhere, like another company or another platform, or export a VM to be moved to another host. So to export, starting in server 2012 R2, you can export a VM while it's running. So you can basically make a copy of it to export it while it's still running, so you don't have to shut it down, which is nice. When you select the export option for a VM, you're prompted to enter the path, which can be a shared path, like a network shared path, like a file server. So after the VM is exported, it can be moved to archival storage as a backup. You can import it to another server, or you can import it to the same server if you want. But when you import, there's really three ways that you can do the import. One is you can register the VM in place, which uses the existing unique ID. So that's option number one. You can restore the VM that uses the existing unique ID. Or you can copy the VM, which creates a new unique ID. So if you were going to import to a system that's still running, you would have to use the third option, right? So let's say you exported the VM, and you might do this if you're making a copy of a machine, right? So you got a clean running Windows server, for example, and you just want to make a copy of it to spin up another version of it. Or sometimes what I'll do is build a machine that has everything, all the stuff that I need, but maybe I'm building a cluster, like a VM guest cluster. So I might make a copy of it 3 or 4 times so that I have 3 or 4 versions, but I know they're all running exactly the same software, so I can go and configure them instead of having to build them each individually. There are other ways to do that too, but this is just one way you can do that that's kind of clean. There's also P2V and V2V migration. The P2V migration is physical to virtual. So this is if you have a physical machine that you're now going to run as a virtual machine. So it converts the physical to a VM. And then there's virtual to virtual, which is going to convert it from one vendor to another. So this could be trying to convert it from VMware to Hyper-V, or Hyper-V to VMware, or VMware to VirtualBox or something like that. And there's some standard formats. We talked about, I think, in the previous course, some of the standard formats for virtual disks. But this is how you would convert those. That's what that's called when you do those conversions. So a physical to virtual machine. So Hyper-V does not natively have tools that can do that. However, in the Microsoft System Center Virtual Machine Manager, there is a tool for managing multiple Hyper-V hosts, which can walk you through doing a conversion to another format. So you can convert to another format with Microsoft System Center. With the Disk2 VHD, which is a free utility that you can download from the internet, you can convert a physical server to a virtual hard disk file. So basically, you run this tool on a physical machine, and it will create that VHD file, that the virtual disk file, which you can then import into Hyper-V. I should tell you though that if you have a lot of data in a system, that's been running for a while, that can be a pretty large disk file. So it's usually good to run this on a clean machine. Maybe after you've just installed and baselined something on a physical, then you can migrate it. But you certainly could do it with a long-running machine. So virtual to virtual. So SCVMM can convert VMs running on VMware ESX update 5 and later to the Hyper-V format. They could previously do Xen Server, but that's no longer supported. And Xen Server is really not very popular anymore. I think the vast majority of organizations are running VMware ESX or ESXi right now, or the free community version of VMware ESX. But if you have Xen Server, it looks like you've got at least a fighting chance of that working. So in this part of this unit, so we covered failover clustering and network load balancing in the first two slide decks. And then in this slide deck, I covered doing clustering and failover within VMs. So I talked about using, some of the special things we have to worry about with Hyper-V in a cluster, but it works almost exactly the same. It's just some special things to worry about. And then I also talked about moving virtual machines. So how to move them between different clusters, how to move them between different instances of Hyper-V that are not clusters with either some connectivity or with no shared files. And then I talked about doing importing and exporting your virtual machines.